When Tom and I moved to Claresville, Jennifer, was sure that it would be the beginning of something new. This little town, snugly nestled by the ocean, beckoned with the promise of peace and harmony. Our house, a snow-white cottage with blue shutters, seemed like the perfect picture of family happiness. But as soon as I was left alone among boxes covered in a layer of travel dust, reality began to take on entirely different shades. Tom, an architect through and through, immediately immersed himself in his work. He had promised that his schedule would become calmer in Claresville, and that he'd have more time for us. But promises remained, just promises. Every day he left at dawn and returned late in the evening, laden with tablets, sketches, and phone calls that there was no escaping from. In the empty rooms of our new home, my footsteps echoed. I found myself either washing windows, endlessly flipping through magazines, or watching the waves crash against the shore. Around me lingered a troubling silence that didn't bode well. One day, while unloading another box, I heard a voice. "Do you need help?" I turned around and saw a tall man with a smile that immediately made me like him. He introduced himself as Jason, our neighbor. "I have a truck in case there's something heavy," he offered, waving toward his old pickup. "Thanks, but it seems like everything is in place already," I replied, trying to smile, although inside I felt completely out of sorts. It turned out that Jason owned a small gallery in the center of town. He stood casually, with his hands in the pockets of his jeans, but there was something in his gaze, as though he understood that I didn't quite feel at home. "If you want to see what Claresville is all about, come by sometime. I can show you the gallery and some other interesting things," he added with a light touch of humor. I nodded, although at that moment his offer seemed like just another way to fill the emptiness. But something in his confidence, in that ease, made me think that maybe it was worth giving it a try. That night, I stared out the window for a long time. The ocean murmured steadily, and the moonlight danced on the waves. But inside me, a storm raged. One I couldn't quite understand. Claresville promised to be a place where I would find peace, yet all I felt was one thing: disconnection. The next morning, I decided to take Jason's offer after all. Not because I particularly wanted to, but more because I needed something to distract myself. I found his gallery in the heart of town, tucked between a vintage bookstore and a cafe with windows filled with homemade pies. Above the gallery door hung a faded sign: J. Harper Gallery, Art for Everyone. Jason greeted me with a friendly smile. "Welcome." "Ready for a little tour?" he asked, handing me a cup of coffee. "Why not?" I replied, trying not to appear too excited. I expected to see the usual collection: seascapes, pastoral countryside scenes, maybe a few amateur portraits. But as soon as I crossed the threshold, it felt like I had entered another world. The gallery was full of works that couldn't be described with a single word. Bright, stirring abstractions, sculptures that seemed to belong to another reality, and photographs that looked almost alive. "This is definitely not a standard gallery," I murmured, stopping in front of a huge canvas where the image of a person dissolved into a swirl of colors. "And thank goodness for that," Jason replied, standing beside me. "Art should stir something inside you. If you don't feel anything when looking at a piece, then it's meaningless." His words made me think. Had I felt anything in my life lately? When was the last time I was truly moved by something, aside from unpacking boxes and waiting for Tom, who still hadn't come home? We wandered through the gallery, chatting about everything. The artists, how the gallery started with 2 paintings given by local masters, how the town inspired creativity. Jason was an easygoing conversationalist, one of those people you could talk to for hours without noticing how time flies. When we stepped out of the gallery, I felt the fresh air fill my lungs, and the weight, the burden that I hadn't even realized I was carrying, seemed to lighten. Jason took me through the streets of Claresville, showing me his favorite spots. A tiny cafe that served the best latte, a wine shop where the owner spoke of each drink as if it were a work of art. "It's easy to get lost here, but even easier to find something that becomes yours," Jason said, nodding toward a display window filled with handmade mugs. "Something like pottery?" I joked. "Exactly. You should try it if you want to distract yourself. We have a great studio on the outskirts of town." His words stayed with me even after I returned home. For the first time in a long while, I found myself thinking, maybe I should try not just filling the emptiness, but finding something that could make me happy. A few days later, I made up my mind. Inspired by Jason's words, I signed up for a pottery class. The studio was located in a small building with windows through which soft light streamed in. Inside, there was the scent of clay and fresh paint, and the walls were decorated with students' works, from the first awkward mugs to true pieces of art. The first lesson wasn't easy. The clay wouldn't cooperate, my fingers kept slipping, and the bowl I was trying to form turned into something strange and asymmetrical. But to my surprise, I wasn't frustrated. On the contrary, the process felt almost meditative. I focused on the movement of my hands, on the texture of the material, on how everything around me faded away, leaving only me and this shapeless mass. Jason would occasionally stop by the studio. He came to visit an old friend, the studio owner, but always found time to check in on the students. His presence was light and unintrusive. He would simply walk over, take a glance at what we were doing, and leave a comment, sometimes with a bit of humor, sometimes serious. "You've got good potential," he told me once, looking at my crooked vase. "It's true. There's something alive in your work. Don't hold back. Let your emotions flow." I laughed, thinking he was just trying to encourage me. But his words stuck with me. Maybe I had been holding myself back for too long. Our interactions extended beyond the studio. A few weeks later, Jason invited me to an exhibition of young artists. I didn't agree immediately. There was still a nagging feeling that it might be wrong. But deep down, I understood. This invitation meant more than just a trip to a gallery. The exhibition was breathtaking. Each piece seemed to tell its own story, and Jason, as always, commented with genuine enthusiasm. At one point, I found myself realizing that I was watching not just the paintings, but him. How he spoke, how he moved, how he lived in this world. After the exhibition, we walked through the evening city. The orange glow of street lamps softly illuminated the cobblestones, and the air smelled of the sea and freshly baked goods. We talked about everything. Art, what it means to be happy, how important it is not to be afraid of trying something new. "Life is too short to live it halfway," he said, looking at the stars reflected in the canal's water. There was a simple truth in his words that sank deep into my consciousness. That evening, for the first time in a long while, I felt alive. Not just existing, but truly living. With each passing day, the feeling of disconnection from Tom grew stronger. His work consumed more and more of his time, and our communication was reduced to rare, brief exchanges. "How was your day?" "Fine. And yours?" These conversations felt hollow, as though we were both avoiding the real issues, knowing they would lead to conflict. One evening, I mustered the courage to say, "Tom, we hardly see each other. I feel like I'm invisible in your life." He, as usual, was sitting behind his laptop, his gaze fixed on the screen. His fingers paused over the keyboard. "Jen, I'm busy. Let's talk about this later, okay?" But later never came. His tomorrow stretched into weeks, and my attempts to reach him were met with the cold wall of his indifference. Meanwhile, Jason had become a part of my new world. He wasn't trying to take anyone's place in my life, but with him, everything seemed brighter, more interesting. We spent more and more time together. He showed me nearby towns, vibrant fairs filled with color and music, shared books that I eagerly read, and then we discussed them for hours. One day, he convinced me to sign up for a reading marathon at the local library. We both chose the same book, a novel about self-discovery. As I read, I realized that the author seemed to be speaking directly to me. The story reminded me that happiness isn't a final destination, but a process, and it has to be built every day. With Jason, I began to feel that life could be rich again. His enthusiasm for every moment, whether it was discussing an old film or tasting a new kind of coffee, became an example for me. But inside me, there was still fear. With every minute I spent with him, I felt like I was teetering on the edge. I was still married, and although my relationship with Tom was falling apart, I wasn't ready to admit that I was building a new world away from him. One evening, when Tom again stayed late at the office, I looked at the empty dining table and realized I couldn't do this anymore. This wasn't life. It was its shadow. And the harder I tried to bring us back to what we once had, the more I felt that I was the only one pulling. But were my meetings with Jason what kept me from falling into that darkness? Or were they just pulling me further away from Tom? That question remained unanswered. Jason suggested we have a picnic. There was something light, carefree about the idea, as though it could be a brief respite from the questions that were tormenting me. We chose a park by the river, a peaceful, secluded spot where ancient oaks rustled with leaves and the water flowed gently between the stones. I made sandwiches, and he brought a blanket and a speaker with music. The day was sunny but not too hot, the perfect weather to feel that life could be simple. We sat on the grass, laughed, listened to the melodies Jason picked with some special taste. Each song seemed to fit the moment perfectly. "You know why I love days like this?" he asked, leaning over to pour juice into glasses. "Why?" "They remind me that happiness can be simple. You don't have to wait for something grand. Sometimes happiness is just food on the grass and the right people around you." I smiled, but inside I felt something deeper. His words touched me. When was the last time I felt so light? We talked about movies, the kind that leave a mark on your soul, the ones you want to watch over and over again. Then he mentioned books that had inspired him to open the gallery. But at some point, the conversation turned more personal. Jason looked at the river and said, almost to himself, "People often get stuck in lives they aren't happy with. They're afraid to admit it, even to themselves, afraid to change anything." Those words took me by surprise. I knew he wasn't talking directly about me, but everything he said reflected my own state. As if he understood what I had been trying to ignore. I was silent for a long time, staring at the water. Then, without looking up, I asked, "What if you no longer know what you want?" Start with something simple. Ask yourself what makes you happy. Just you. Without other people, without obligations. I lifted my gaze. In his eyes, there was no judgment, no attempt to pressure me, just honesty. That moment was a turning point for me. Not because I found answers, but because I realized I could no longer avoid them. On the way back to the car, we walked in silence. 1,000 thoughts spun in my mind. Was the life I had built with Tom the life I truly wanted? Or was I holding on to it out of fear of the unknown? I knew I couldn't stay in this state of uncertainty, but the answers didn't come immediately. Jason was right. It had to start with the simple things, with the questions I had been so afraid of asking. I found more and more reasons to leave the house. Pottery classes, intimate concerts, photography workshops. These became part of my new routine. There was a charm in these activities, but most importantly, they gave me the chance to spend time with Jason. I wasn't looking for excuses. I simply wanted to be where I felt good. With Jason, I could talk about anything. Art, books, films, travel. Our conversations were endless, as were the topics we discovered. It felt like each of us was uncovering something new in the other. For the first time in many years, I felt truly heard. But at home, the air was increasingly tense. Tom started noticing my frequent absences. One evening, when I returned from a photography workshop, he was sitting on the couch with that look I hadn't seen in a long time, an expression of suspicion and fatigue. "You've been spending a lot of time with the neighbor, haven't you?" he asked, not looking at me. I froze, feeling my heart pound in my chest. "Yes, we run into each other often, but it's just friendship, Tom." "Just friendship?" He gave a bitter half-smile. "You're gone almost every evening. I don't even know what you're doing. It feels like we're living different lives." I wanted to argue, but fell silent. He was right. We really were living different lives. But was that all my fault? Hadn't he left me alone with this emptiness? If you were home sometimes, you'd know what I'm doing, I said, trying not to raise my voice. Tom stood up, rubbing his hand through his hair in confusion. That's not an excuse, Jen. We don't talk. We don't spend time together. And I don't know how to fix it. Those words struck me deeper than I expected. Not because they were surprising, but because I had known for a long time. We both weren't willing to put in the effort. And the more time I spent away from him, the clearer it became. But I still wasn't ready to admit that our relationship might be over. The next day, I met with Jason again. We went to a chamber concert, and there, surrounded by soft music and the warm glow of candles, I felt like I was where I wanted to be. But inside me, the feeling of guilt was growing. It was as if I was trying to split my life into two parts, one with Tom, the other with Jason. And both felt incompatible. I kept catching myself trying to figure out where my life had gone wrong. But instead of answers, I only grew more entangled. That evening, I came home later than usual. Tom was there, which in itself was a surprise. He stood in the kitchen, his face tense but not angry. In front of him was a printed sheet, several lines of text that I recognized immediately. It was a message from Jason, which I had accidentally left open on my phone. "Can you explain this?" he asked, holding the paper as though it were evidence in a court case. I felt the blood drain from my face. The message wasn't overtly compromising, but it contained a warm sincerity that had been missing from our conversations for a long time. "It's not what you think, Tom. It's just friendship," I said. But my voice trembled, and I knew it didn't sound convincing. He was silent for several long seconds, then looked at me with the weariness that had been building for years. "You don't even believe that yourself," he said quietly. "Friendship? Every evening, every time you leave? Do you think I don't see how much you've changed?" Changed? I felt a surge of anger. Maybe because I can't live like I did before. "You were never there, Tom. Never. You drowned yourself in your work and forgot about me. And you decided to find comfort in someone else?" His voice rose. "If we had problems, why didn't you tell me?" I shot back. "I tried. But you were always too busy to hear me." The conversation turned into a storm of accusations and justifications, and at some point, we both fell silent, as though we had run out of breath. Tom sat at the table, his head in his hands, and I stood there, unsure of what to do. "I felt for a long time that we've been drifting apart," he finally said. "But I didn't think it would go this far. Do you even understand how I feel?" His words hit me because deep down I knew he was right. It wasn't only his fault. We had both allowed our life to become an empty shell. We had stopped being a team, becoming two people living under one roof. "What do you want from me, Tom?" I asked softly. He looked at me for a long time, and in his eyes I saw more sadness than anger. "I want you to be honest with yourself. And with me. We've been pretending the whole time that we have a chance to get back what we had before. But Jen, if you've already made your choice, just tell me." His words hung in the air, and I didn't know what to say. Everything I felt was too tangled. Yes, I enjoyed my time with Jason, but was I ready to break what bound me to Tom? Or was I simply running from problems that I couldn't solve? I don't know, Tom," I finally admitted. "I really don't know." That truth was painful for both of us. Tom nodded, as though he understood that this was the only thing I could say. "Then maybe we should live apart for a while," he suggested, his voice surprisingly calm. "Maybe that will help us figure things out." I was silent for a long time, but in the end, I agreed. Deep down, I knew this moment was inevitable. A few days after my conversation with Tom, I moved into a small house on the outskirts of the city. It was simple, with wooden furniture and a small garden, but that's exactly what I needed. A space where I could be alone with myself and perhaps finally hear my own thoughts. I left my things unpacked and simply sat on the floor in the living room, listening to the silence. There was something terrifying about that silence, but at the same time, it was freeing. For the first time in a long while, I didn't have to justify myself or explain my actions to anyone. I could just be me, although I still didn't know what that meant. Jason found out about my move, but he didn't rush to intervene. He just sent a short message. "If you need anything, you know where to find me." That was the right thing to do. I knew I needed to sort things out on my own before letting anyone else become part of my life. I immersed myself back into pottery. I spent long hours in the studio, creating new shapes that, to me, seemed to reflect the inner changes I was going through. For the first time, I began to feel that art could indeed be a way to find myself. Each vase, each mug became a small victory, a tiny step towards harmony. In addition, I started volunteering at an animal shelter. It was loud and chaotic, but this activity filled me with purpose. Helping those who needed it distracted me from my own doubts and pain. Riding the wave of these changes, I suggested to the owner of the gallery where Jason worked that we organize an exhibition for emerging artists. The idea inspired me, and I threw myself into the preparations. There was something special about helping others showcase their work to the world, just as I had once been helped. Tom called occasionally. Our conversations became less tense, but more cautious. We both understood that this time apart was necessary for both of us to figure out what we wanted. Jason and I continued to stay in touch, but now our meetings were less frequent and took on a different tone. I felt that he was giving me space, and I was grateful for that. We could talk for hours about the books we had read or plans for the exhibition, but he no longer raised topics that might put me in an uncomfortable position. One evening, sitting in my garden, I caught myself thinking that, for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. Not absolute happiness, not euphoria, but peace. I realized that my journey to myself had only just begun, but for the first time, I felt comfortable walking that path. My happiness couldn't depend on another person. It had to come from within. And I decided that I would build my life based on that understanding. Jason and Tom, they both became important parts of my journey. But now I knew. To be happy, I had to find harmony inside myself.